So I was going to talk about China and Iran and stuff, but the obvious elephant in the room is Putin and his nuclear rhetoric. And the reality is that when you look at what's going on, Putin hasn't really escalated the nuclear rhetoric. He's escalated all other forms of rhetoric, the attacks against Western history and the anger at what the West has done to Russia in his mind. The idea that there is some sort of hypocrisy out there that Russia is treated poorly because it's can't. I mean, the reality is it's a shitty country and it's managed very shittily, and they can't elevate themselves to a point where they are on par with the United States, the United Kingdom, France, etc. They're not even a top 10 economy. Because of that, Putin feels the need to enhance his relevance, and therefore he makes these bombastic speeches. We can't take them lightly, though. We have to look at them seriously, because the reality is we can't inherently know what Putin really is thinking, and we can only kind of surmise based on what makes the most sense. But we assume that position of making the most sense as logical people. He could have completely fucking lost it at this point, and we don't know. But because of that, the nuclear issue comes up. And I made a video about this a while back, but I'm going to revisit it because the question continues to come up, and largely because Putin forces the question to come up. His aims with this speech were to try to strike fear into the West to back off from Ukraine. It was also aimed to strike fear in Ukraine to end the war on some sort of ceasefire terms that Russia may not necessarily have considered favorable in the beginning, but it might be the best they can get now. And so he uses these nuclear saber rattling to try and accomplish that. When it comes to Russia's nuclear weapons, and I've said this before, there are two types. They have the strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. Now, the reality is any nuclear weapon is pretty much considered strategic because it changes the strategic calculus of the outcome of a war. In this situation, let's say Russia uses a smaller tactical quote-unquote nuclear weapon. That still has strategic implications, as the U.S. has said repeatedly they would respond severely to such an action, and that obviously has strategic implications. But for the purposes of discussion here, he would use what is essentially a 50 kiloton weapon or smaller. Now, if you were to use a 50 kiloton weapon, it would be able to destroy, kill, and maim an area roughly of 2 square miles. So basically a borough of New York. So if you live in New York City, they could take out the entirety of Manhattan. That's devastating, obviously, but it's not enough on a large battlefield like we see here across multi-dimensional spaces, specifically when the battlefield goes from Izium all the way to Kherson. He would likely need to use multiple tactical nuclear weapons in order to achieve the effect of even winning, but if even that, freezing where the front lines, halting a Ukrainian counteroffensive. He couldn't just use one. One would potentially be seen as just a warning, but it wouldn't stop the Ukrainian march. He would actually physically have to stop them with these nuclear weapons, which would require dozens, if not hundreds. The problem is he's got to weigh whether the operational effect of using nuclear weapons will outweigh what would essentially be an incredibly high cost to him and his country in the face of a potential NATO retaliation for using such weapons. There's 2 potential scenarios if he were to use a tactical nuclear weapon. That is one of creating terror, and that is one that is of shoring up the front lines. If he wanted to try to create terror to get the Ukrainian government and the West to back off, he would hit a major city center such as Kyiv, trying to kill Zelensky, basically showing Ukraine, I hit your major city center with a nuke and I'll continue to do this. You need to move to the negotiating table. He would hope to shock Ukraine into surrender and shock the West into cutting off aid. That is highly unlikely. a use of a nuclear weapon, especially when the United States is the main backer right now of Ukraine, both financially and militarily. And I'm not trying to disparage any other country. Other countries are doing a wonderful job in helping Ukraine. The reality, though, is if Europe backed off from Ukraine, Ukraine still has the United States, and the United States is enough for Ukraine to continue to successfully prosecute this war. So that's unlikely to happen. It's not likely that he would use it as a terror attack. In reality, he would probably try to strike the front lines. It would be a huge gamble in which he would try to hit multiple areas of the front lines where Russia is the weakest and where there are key areas such as Lyman, Kherson, shoring up the front lines of Severodonetsk. The gains would be limited, though, because he couldn't kill everyone. He would essentially irradiate the region, but even though Russian military doctrine has shown that they're supposed to be able to operate a nuclear area, they can't even operate in a non-nuclear environment. They're struggling so badly in a conventionally normal environment that I feel like their movements or their efforts to even operate in a nuclear environment would move to zero. And there's a good chance they would kill a lot of their own troops, but Putin might be all about that. So at best, a use of such nuclear weapons would freeze the war. It would freeze it in place and potentially buy Putin time in the hopes that the European Union would fracture under the loss of Russian gas. And this winter is going to be difficult for the European Union and the United Kingdom. Make no mistake, no amount of plus up from all of these countries is going to be able to replace Russia's energy that quickly. They'll be in a better place next year. So if we can survive this winter, Russia's in a really, really bad spot. But the reality is I just don't think that he would be successful in using them. In fact, using them would be far more detrimental because I think China, who is generally shied away from nuclear saber rattling until potentially recently, they're the types that would say it but would be appalled by its use. And then India would absolutely divorce itself from any relations to Russia with the use of a nuclear weapon. But the West would galvanize. The West would absolutely come together, and we would back Ukraine, and we would likely get involved. So with that in mind, the more Putin starts to realize he can't achieve decisive military effects on the Ukrainian battlefield with nuclear weapons, because the West and because Ukraine is not backing down, because he would need to use multiple, and every time if he uses more than one, it just ramps up the potential for a massive retaliation against Russia, both economically and militarily, for doing such a thing. I don't think the United States would depose Putin in Moscow and we would be seeing Abrams tanks in Red Square, but I think certainly the more nuclear weapons Putin were to use, the more likely the United States and NATO would get involved in Ukraine, ejecting Russia from that country. However, because Putin probably likely sees that nuclear weapons won't achieve any true battlefield changes without massive amounts of attacks, not just one, and the threat of a direct Western conventional military intervention where they come in and do something, I think it's just less likely that Putin conducts a nuclear attack. I think he's just hoping that the rhetoric gets people to back off, but in reality, the rhetoric is just pissing people off even more. And it's really a lose-lose situation for him. There's no way out of this at this point. He is in a situation where I don't think he's in a place where he wants to take the whole world down, and he can't. He can't take the whole world down with him, because inevitably the entirety of Russia would be destroyed. But who knows? He could be crazy. And like I said in my previous video, it could be if Russia's going down, or if he's going down, Russia and as many people as possible are going down with him. So I know that's not very confidence-inducing, but sorry, that's where we're at.